I want to start by doing something that is a tradition here, and I've said this several times. It's not a tradition yet in the US, and I feel like I'm going to start to make it a tradition, because I actually thank you. I actually think it's a beautiful tradition, and I actually think it matters. And if I pronounce things incorrectly, my apologies in advance. But I want to say I acknowledge that the land that we're on is Treaty 1 territory land, and it's the land of the Anishinaabe, the Innu, the Oji-Cree, the Cree, the Dakota, the Dene, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I think that it speaks to some of the differences between our countries, that the crushing history of the destruction of labor and the real history of the United States is such that we mostly couldn't tell you what land we're on when we're on it, right? And that is a reason why when I come here, every time I'm in Canada, I think it's really important, and I think I should do this when I go home. I can tell you that when I'm home in my home where I was born, in New York, I do know a lot about the Iroquois Federation. And in my house, it mattered that we understood who the Iroquois Federation was. So I'm glad that I came from the sort of the land of the Five Nations, and that in my family it actually mattered that we knew that we were standing on a land of people who had a matriarchal-based system in what we think of now as New York. And then I went on to major in Native American Studies before I dropped out. Okay, that's a small detail. But I was majoring in Native American Studies back when I was, I think, 16. I didn't make it all that long in undergrad, so the PhD is a mystery. But anyway, but I also want to do another Canadian thing while I'm here, because I think it matters too, right, in terms of honoring the traditions of your country, which is just a brief moment of saying bonsoir. C'est un plaisir de pouvoir partager quelques idées avec vous. Actually, je parle français. That was really clever. But what I want to say is that I think it isn't a throwaway line to say workers of the world unite. In fact, we're seeing it more and more all the time. And if we're thinking about some of the things that we have to do better, like better going forward, which is a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight, thinking about building global workers' movements is one of the things that we have to do better. So even though I find it odd whenever I'm anywhere else in the world talking, given the crap that's going on in my own country, it's also increasingly clear to me, I hate to say it, and it's really increasingly true in Canada again, the crap is going on all over the place, right? All over. And the only people who have figured out globalization really well are the wrong people, and that's the capitalists. So in that sense, I'm glad to be here. And something else that came out from two things that Tim and Glenn said earlier before, the incredible dancers and the amazing chorus, who I loved, there they are. Another round of applause! Relational that I just want to say before I go into like strikes, which is my favorite topic, which is like Tim in his introduction. I grew up in a hall too, actually. There's Tim, I'm looking that way. I grew up in a hall too, in some very real way, and I'm sure it had a huge influence on me. And the hall I grew up in was Local 973 of the United Brotherhood of Carpenters. My father went from being a trade unionist to being a politician before I was born. And my mother died when I was a little girl. And the consequence of that is that I grew up basically being babysat by, let's be clear, the secretaries of the union, the administrative staff, and a whole lot of men who I really thought were all my brothers when I was very, very little, because they all called themselves my brothers. So I was like, wow, I have like 500 brothers. I actually have 6, but like 500 felt pretty good. So I literally was parked in the Carpenters Union Hall a lot of my childhood. And I think I think watching union meetings and being parked in the hall and left there for days on end, sometimes really, had something to do with my childhood and something to do with my adulthood. And the other thing that was really prescient about the introduction that Glenn connected to, that I thought I should share, I didn't know about that Linda Sarsour story until, of course, when I was listening to Glenn introduce the history of the Ukrainian Labour Temple, which is, how special is it to be here? It's wonderful. But that introduction reminds us of the moment that we're in, right? It's tense out there. It's super, what's happening all over the world right now is super intense. And the idea that Linda Sarsour was being chased around, or what, I don't know the whole story except what Glenn just said, right? And that was enough for me to hear a reminder of how tense the moment is. When I was a child, in addition to being dumped in the Carpenters Union Hall as a routine habit, there was a famous moment also that is big in my childhood. It was 1971. I was young enough, not quite to remember it, but I feel like I was because I heard the story all the time anyway in the house. My father was not quite county executive, but close to that in New York in a very large county, which meant he was in charge of the county and the township police and all that stuff, right, as an elected leader. And there was a moment in 71, I believe, when Angela Davis was coming to speak. So think about the time. Yeah. Angela Davis was coming to speak in 71 at the local community college, which was Rockland Community College. And at the last minute, because of pressure from, you know, imagine who, races, whatever, police, etc., everyone, the cops, the security on campus and the cops refused to give her security. And there were threats against her life. And my father, who at the time, you know, held fairly high political office, got so pissed off in that moment, like this temple did in the Linda Sarsour moment a couple weeks ago, it sounds like, that he said that he was inviting her to speak in the town hall in his chambers, and then his cops wouldn't direct traffic, and so he famously was shown on the front page of the newspaper with his sleeves rolled up, directing traffic for Angela Davis to speak in the county office. Probably actually all you need to know about me are those two stories. So I grew up on picket lines in Carpenters Union Hall, on picket lines, and my father took the history of the Iroquois Confederation as the land of New York, and Angela Davis all very seriously. So when we also flew the Earth Day flag in 1970 off of the town car for 3 years. So something about the environmental movement, anti-racist politics, trade unions, and defending free speech rights was like the stew from which I came. So tonight, then, I want to talk about that stew, right? And how we do stuff just like that all the time because it really matters. So I had the pleasure of learning quite a bit today, and I've been reading about the 1919 General Strike. And even some stuff I heard today made me think even a little bit more about some comments I want to make this evening. But just for starters, I want to say I'm going to focus more on the next 25 years. I feel like there's a ton of experts in this room, a ton, and there's more than even in this room, right? But I've met a few today who are walking encyclopedias about the strike. And we should all listen to them because it is an incredible history. But I'm going to focus on what's going to happen when you commemorate the 125th anniversary, or what I hope is going to happen when you commemorate the 125th anniversary. Which is going to be in 2044. I want to focus on what story are you going to tell in 2044 about the 25 years that came before. And in some real ways, I want to focus on the next 11 years. Because there's this little thing called the IPCC and the recent reports about the increasing climate crisis. The extinction that's happening, and there's a lot of very serious things happening out there right now. So when I think about the work as an organizer, first, I think about what does it take to build an 11-year plan. I think we have to figure out another round of general strikes by 2030. So I'm going to put a point on it. If we have 11 years to figure out how to deal with the fossil fuel question and humanity and some kind of fairness about who's going to be living through the various crises, we already can see who's suffering from the climate crisis as they're emerging, right? The huge storms and whatnot. And it's not, unfortunately, Jeff Bezos and a whole lot of people I shouldn't name, or I'll just get sued, whatever. But it's not, right? It's mostly people of color and poor people who so far are drowning and having their houses taken away in storms. So that could sound depressing, but I don't actually, that is depressing. But I think, as an organizer, I think about hard deadlines all the time. And I've just woken up in the last few months and thought, okay, so 2030 is the deadline. And everywhere I go, I want to think about what it means for us to get ready to put in place the kind of action plan that could yield another general strike. I want to talk more about the general strike. I hope that's going to happen in Winnipeg and throughout Canada and throughout the world. That's my focus. So, and when we think about extinction, the climate crisis, and the ecological crisis, I also just want to park for a minute and say something I heard about today at the conference was about the erasure of history. And I want to say two things about the erasure of history. One is that, in a big way, we erase working class history, right? We just erase it. And part of why this conference is so exciting is because you're lifting up a really important moment in working class history. But we also know that the working class is complicated, and our movements are complicated. So I was hearing today some stories about Shoal Lake and the building of the aqueduct, which was all happening around the same time as 1919, and the complicated history of the erasure of the Native Americans from some of the activities that were leading up to the 1919 strike. And to me, there's something about the climate crisis and indigenous wisdom that go hand in hand. So when I think about the work we have to do to get smarter and better by the 2030 general strike, one of the things we have to do is bring the indigenous worldview back into our politics, along with dealing with questions of race and gender and a whole lot of things that we know, frankly, as a trade union movement, that we can get better at. So if we're thinking about what's the story we're going to tell on the 125th anniversary, one of the first things I want to say is we have to reintegrate the ecology question. We probably do that naturally if we bring the indigenous folks to whose land we're standing on back into our movement in a central way. That probably happens, they go together. We have to get really better at dealing with racism inside the ranks, as well as gender and sexism and patriarchy. So that's a note, that's like, let's put that on the flip chart. If we're making a flip chart of things to do on the to-do list to get ready for the 2030 general strike. Now, I like thinking about the 2030 general strike for the same reason I love being a trade union organizer and a trade union negotiator. And that's because we literally live in a constant state of deadlines, and a constant state of deadlines that have real consequences to them. We have contract expirations. We have elections when workers are trying to form new unions. They're loaded with all sorts of trigger moments and deadlines. We have political cycles, right? Actual elections. And elections matter. And I think it was also interesting in the dialogue that was happening at the conference today that there was a comment about how it's never been true that we can sort out strikes from political history. Like strikes and politics and whether or not the army is called out on us, they're all relevant and they're all tied together. And part of when Krishna mentioned that I had just finished a book, it's true, like literally Monday, off to copy edit. Part of what I was interrogating in the book is the 1934 strikes that were happening in the United States. And I just want to say this for just a second on the question of politics and deadlines. It's so important that we actually don't get caught up in too many crazy debates in a way that we sometimes can, because we know politics matters, and we know strikes matter. Like, politics matters and strike matters. And the main reason why politics matter, and it's going to come out a lot in the book I have, the forthcoming book, is because in the US, when we got to the New Deal, right, and now we want a new Green Deal, but when we got to the original New Deal, we got to it because first we elected FDR, right, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and then instead of people going home and like, oh yeah, we elected them and now we can like go back to our work, the 18 left-led unions said it's time for massive strikes. So it's electing someone who feels better from a party that feels better and then turning to massive strikes to force the agenda that we want on the people that we often elect and then just let them go off and govern like as if they don't even know who we are. You know what I mean? So it's like strikes. So it's strikes in a major way before, during, and after. Like, they need not stop. That's like a super important message. And so to have a 2030 general strike, it's going to take a lot of discipline and a lot of method. I know that sounds sexy, doesn't it? Like after you had a bunch of beers. McAlevey's here to talk about discipline and method. But I kind of am, but I'm going to make it fun for a few minutes. Because in every strike I've ever had the pleasure of leading, they were not spontaneous, they were not wildcats, and they did not like happen because 4 months earlier we thought a strike was a good idea. They took years of planning. So I want to talk a little bit about that in the context of 1919. So when I look back at 1919 and I think about 2030, I think, oh my God, general strikes. I can't even imagine them because they haven't happened in my lifetime, not in the US, right? We haven't had anything like a general strike in my entire lifetime. We have had some strikes. I'm going to talk about some recent ones in a minute. We have had some strikes, some that I've been involved in and some that I've helped lead. And I can tell you that from the very first strike I was ever involved in, they're hard as hell. Like one strike is hard as hell. One good strike, a good strike, and I'll define that in a minute, is hard as hell. So to get to a general strike is going to take actually a lot of method and a lot of discipline, really. So I want to quote something about 1919 that was in Owen Tave's book on Winnipeg. And he says, in 1919, the bosses lined up at the North End Labour Temple to ask permission to operate during the strike. That's my vision of the future, by the way, okay? So to actually get to the place where the bosses line up and ask permission is going to take a lot of work. And I actually think it's on us because the moment's kind of urgent. Like we're back in a moment where we're trending towards fascism or we're trending towards something much better. And I think that choice is becoming increasingly clear. It feels like that in Ontario last I looked, and it feels like that in Washington, D.C., and it feels like that in Germany where I've just spent a lot of time, and it feels like that in England, and it feels like that in Australia, and it feels like that every damn place I go right now. Every country I go to. There's a rise of the radical right, and there's like an insurgent, populist, progressive, radical kind of thing happening. The question is who's going to win, and I think we have to. So that means we have to get it together at a pretty much seriously higher level than we have, right? Seriously higher level. So the second thing that really strikes me that's really relevant, besides that my vision is that I want bosses asking workers for permission, like, are we allowed to do something today? And then the second thing is 95 out of 96 unions voted to go out on a sympathy strike, right, with the metal trades in 1919. I want to say it again. 95 of 96, and the 96 one, right, we know they asked them not to go out at that point. So 95 of 96 unions voted to go out in a sympathy strike. I don't think we need to have a long discussion about this, but how many people think we're ready for 95 out of 96 unions to agree to do anything tomorrow? Okay? So we have a lot of work to do. A lot of work to do. But the important thing is, before I go on to the present, a basic fact of the world in which we live, a basic fact of the power structure analysis of Canada, the United States, and frankly, most of the world at this point. I have to just get this off my chest. I'm in so many debates all the time with people. There is nothing more powerful in capitalist systems than workers withdrawing their labor. Nothing. There is one thing that the capitalist class needs workers to do. All of us, any of us, every day. There's really literally one thing, and that's go to work. They don't care what else happens to us. They don't give a rat's ass. They care about one thing. Workers show up and go to work. And so when we get really good at making it so that workers actually decide not to show up and go to work, it's our biggest power source. You can occupy bridges, you can shut down London, loved all that stuff they were doing a couple weeks ago, we can do whatever, occupy plazas and squares. When we withdraw our labor, we win. That's what happened in 1919. Now the question of did they win, whatever. Look, Canada's a nicer place, though there's a lot of, okay, it's a complicated topic, but like, we won a lot more, for real. And we're gonna have to do it all over again. And that is really for real, and do it better, as I mentioned, right? Less patriarchy, less racism, less bringing the indigenous, like. But folks, when we withdraw our labor and keep the military troops out of the streets, we win, and that's why politics matters. And that's why people, I feel like when people are critical, and you get into like these really critical debates about all sorts of things, it's like in 1934, and in 1935, and in 1936, by the way, after we elected FDR again for a second time, the moment in our history in the US when people went all out for politics for the first time in the trade union movement was 1936, because labor law had just been passed. And unions who had never done much with politics understood it was all going to be taken away. And so in 1936, they didn't just focus on politics of re-electing FDR, by the way. They focused on two things, speaking of the power structure analysis. They actually were focused on taking the governorships, this is a hint about, provinces, just saying. They focused on the governorships of two states, Michigan and Pennsylvania, in the 1936 elections in the United States. Why do you think they focused on making sure, as a trade union movement, that they won control of Michigan and Pennsylvania, so that the troops wouldn't be called out at the state level against them when they occupied the factories, coal and auto? They strategically selected, there's two sectors we're going to build power in. So we need to take not just the feds, we had the feds, we had a national president who no longer called out the US Army on workers when they went on strikes. That really matters, and that's part of the complication in 1919, right? Troops come out. So we got to take control of the feds to stop the troops from coming out, and then we got to deal with the, in your case, provincial level. And in 1930, I never knew until I was doing research for the book I just finished, how much of a serious, smart, brilliant focus there was on going all out to take the governorships in the two states where the strategists and the organizers on the left understood that they were going to go for broke with massive strikes, and that was Michigan and Pennsylvania. So it's a fact that under capitalism there is nothing more powerful than workers withdrawing their labor. That's just a fact. The challenge now is how do you build a better labor movement? How do you actually build a better labor movement? We know we need a better labor movement. We know we need a better labor movement. That's a global statement. Although I'm pretty excited by a lot of things that are happening. So the point that I want to make about building a better labor movement is it's not going to happen unless you're deep in it. Like, we can't actually just talk about it and wish for a better labor movement and be critical of the one on days when it pisses us off. We actually have to be in it to fix it. So that's sort of like a challenge, a sweet challenge to the audience, that if we want a better labor movement, we actually have to be in it hard. And I know a lot of people in this room are, believe me. Some of the people in the crowd have been in it for a lot longer than I've been alive. So I appreciate that. I'm just saying, like, if we understand that workers withdrawing their labor is the most powerful thing we can do under capitalism, in a moment that's very scary right now worldwide, then we all have to get better about how do we do that. And I want to talk about that for the next 12 or so minutes before we drink and be merry and more. So I want to transition into the good news, because there is some really good news. And I don't have pictures to show you, so you just have to get the images in your head. But the good news is, in terms of workers of the world uniting, that in the United States, in 2018, we had more workers on strike than we've had in the past 30 years, I think combined. Yeah, by a lot. And the strikes where workers are winning right now, I think is not very different than 1919. But the strikes where we're winning really big in the US right now have three commonalities between them. Three things that we have to do really well at. One is they were 100% out. 100% out. Every single worker. Two, they had worked very hard to build broad community support long before the strike began. So the community didn't just rise up in support of them. They did serious, deliberate work to make sure that the goals of the strikes were consistent with the broader community, and that the broader community was going to stand with them and not the bosses when they went out. And the third commonality of the really successful strikes in 2018 and 2019 in the United States is that they started as movements from below in the rank and file. That there were a group of workers in every case who said, we're not sure we love what's happening at the top leadership of our organization, and so we're going to dive in and make it better. That was my point about, like, we need to dive in and make it better. If we understand under capitalism, nothing's more powerful than workers walking off the job. hello 1919, and if we have the right politics to keep the troops from mowing us down in the streets, which is crucial, then we have to understand that the same skills that we need to get broadly to another 1919 kind of moment, we need to actually help make sure that we have leadership in our unions that want to wake up and see the community as their number one ally and the thing for which we are going on strike, right? For making a better world. So, I'll just name a few of them. West Virginia, which in 2018 kind of kicked off. I don't use the word wave, by the way. I have a particular hatred for that word. I'm just saying it. I don't believe in waves. It makes me feel like we're having like an oceanic cycle. When workers in West Virginia decided to take no more shit and walk off the job, all 34,000 of them, it wasn't an act of nature. It was many, many months of planning, right? They decided, we're done here. And for people who don't know it, the West Virginia leaders, they came out of the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016. So it was a bunch of young-ish leaders in the teachers union, and then who teamed up with a bunch of people in the bus drivers and the service workers union, totally important to the history of that strike. It was all of them. And they came out of the Bernie Sanders campaign and they thought, Jesus, oh man, what do we do now? And what do we do now became, well, we're going to start getting ready to have some series of different outcomes to what's going on in our next round of, in their case, healthcare negotiations. So it was a movement from below. And what's interesting when I heard about some of the 1919s, some of the debate about, you know, the striker committee, it looks kind of white, it looks kind of male, it looks, you know, those things, we look at the pictures, they're amazing pictures. And how radical were they versus not, right? All the debates that you're having about 1919, I just go to the present moment. And I want to say that if you read the newspaper stories, if we think about history and how do we tell it and who reads it and how it gets told, if you look at the newspaper coverage of West Virginia, you're going to see Dale Lee and Christine Campbell quoted all the time. They're the two heads of the two big teachers unions in West Virginia. They did not start that strike. All right? So it's like, who's in the picture versus how things are happening on the ground is a super important part of how we think about history. So in a movement from below in West Virginia, they did work with their union. And this is important. They worked with their union. But they created the movement from below and the pressure that left the leadership essentially no choice but to decide, geez, we're either opposing our workers or we're going to go out on a mass strike with them. And the leadership made the correct decision, by the way. Sometimes people in West Virginia say to me, well, Jane, they didn't really have much of a choice, we were all walking out. But in fact, it's more complicated than that. The leadership did actually decide to work with them. And by the way, that decision is a really important decision in the history of the West Virginia strike as well. So I call it the interaction effect when I'm not after pierogies and dessert and beer. If we were having a long academic discussion, I'm writing right now for academic papers about something called the interaction effect, which is what it really takes to win big, which is some of the skills that some of the top union leadership really does possess from years and years of negotiations and politics, and an incredibly smart upsurge from the rank and file below. It takes both, and it's going to take both for us to actually get it done. So, I want to just talk for a few minutes about what I think is the biggest, most, a little bit judgmental. I want to talk about the most recent strike that actually in some ways was the biggest strike of all the strikes that have happened in the US. And I just want to use it as a story about how we're going to have how we're going to be ready by 2030 if we need to have a general strike. So, and that's Los Angeles. We'll talk about the Los Angeles teachers strike for my closing, for my story about how to do this better and how it ties to 1919. So West Virginia gets stuff started, and then a whole bunch more goes, right? We got Oklahoma, we had Tennessee, we had Colorado, then we get the big one again, that was Arizona, that was 75,000 out. Then we had the fall come last year and a little less attention, but super important round of strikes against the Marriott Hotel Corporation by Unite Here. 7-city, multiple state, massive strike against Marriott. I want to note that one just because it was part of the big 2018 set of strikes that began and that are still going. There were 20,000 out in Oregon yesterday. If you don't know that, there were 20,000 educators out in Oregon yesterday. So we are not done, we are going. So what's interesting about it is the West Virginia teachers get their motivation from Chicago. That's clear. The Chicago Teachers Union strike in 2012. And the point about 1919 that matters when I was reading some of the history, and that matters for today, and why strikes happening in the US matter, is because workers learn to go on strike by watching other workers go on strike and win. Yes. Okay? Workers get up the gumption to go on strike by watching other workers go on strike and win. So I'm going to close by telling you about how Los Angeles teachers, which was 34,000 out in January, won. Because what they did, quite frankly, was a master class in massive strikes. It was a master class in how to get to a huge strike. So I'm not going to tell it all to you. There's a book coming about it. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Just a little bit. When the Los Angeles strike went out in January, there were 65,000 people every day in Los Angeles in the pouring rain. Anyone see the pictures from the Los Angeles strike this January? So 65,000 people. Organizers do a lot of math. I want to be clear about this. Organizers do a lot of math. There were 65,000 people out every single day in the main square in Los Angeles, which is a hard thing to do in a city that's so discombobulated. And there's only 34,000 teachers. So right off the bat, it means they picked up another, 30,000 and change minimally every single day of the strike, who were in the plaza. And these are like police estimates, right? So we can guess it was larger. I'm going with the safe number of 65,000. That's the police estimate. The diaries, the letters, the pamphlets, the something, the Jewish archives, the Ukrainian Labour Temple archives, because the newspapers are not ever telling us the story. So the master class called Los Angeles Teachers was so unbelievably exciting. So here it goes. First, the progressives inside the union, teachers, who had been all sort of arguing about perfect left positions for a long time, decided to stop arguing about their perfect left positions, and in 2014 the left united and formed a caucus called Union Power. So note to selves, like get over our shit and get it together, okay? Because there isn't time for like intellectual rubbish. So a bunch of the progressive caucuses, the Women's Caucus, Latina Caucus, Black Caucus, like there were like 90 caucuses in LA forever, and then a bunch of white guys were running the thing into the ground. So finally all the other people realized they were going to stop having positions and like figure out how to win. So they put together a slate called Union Power in 2014, and they won all top offices in the union, every single one of them, 7, all 7, count them, 7 full-time offices. They were smart organizers and campaigned their ass off. Leader ID, structure test, everything every book I wrote ever talked about, every single thing I talked about was happening in Los Angeles, first for them to win top offices in the union. And then, when they swept all 7 seats, even before they won, they had this is important, they actually had a plan before they won. And here's what the plan was. The plan was, the day they win, they're going to hire a bunch of staff who know how to run strikes. Period. Their plan was to hire a bunch of staff who know how to run strikes. And I'm not kidding. And another debate that we have that makes me crazy all over the world is like the role of the rank and file, the role of the staff, the role of the rank and file, the role of the staff. That interaction effect thing I'm talking about, like get over it. The teachers hadn't had a strike in 30 years in Los Angeles. Most teachers had never been on strike. They didn't know how to do a strike. They just won office. And then they were like, let's go hire some people who know how to do this, because they could probably teach us something. And so the interaction between the brilliant rank and file progressive trade union leadership and a bunch of staff who knew how to strike mattered to everything that happened in LA. So they hired the staff who knew how to strike. They have names. Brian McNamara used to work with me in Vegas, used to work with Salvador, whatever. We go like, these people knew how to run strikes, right? Some of us, we know how to do that, and everyone needs to learn how to do it. So the rank and file leaders hired incredibly smart professional staff immediately. Like they were in place by October, 3 months later. And the rank and file leader said, so go do that thing you know how to do, build a 100% participation union. Go build a 100% participation union from a union where everyone was asleep, basically, for like 30 years. So like apathy, all those words come up, okay. So how do we go from the words I heard a lot about today, again, exclusion, inclusion, exclusion. How do we go to building a 100% inclusive union? Well, if you want to be strike ready, which is the decision they made, they literally won office and said we're going to become strike ready. Strike ready means hiring staff who know to run strikes. And then they said, the next thing we're going to do after we build the organizing department is we're going to build a parent department, which is the community outreach team, staff, the people who know how to do community organizing, a research department, and a proactive communications department. And in every single position, they hired staff who had been in strikes before. So experience and our radical politics together matter. And that's essentially the story of what happened in Los Angeles. They got it together between the progressive rank and file and a bunch of people who actually knew how to get the work done. And for the next 4 years, I can see Krishna, he's going to come and get me, which is great. For the next 4 years, they carried out 12 structure tests. Who doesn't know the word structure test? Put your hand up. That's pretty good. Thanks. That makes me feel happy, like someone's maybe read something. So structure tests are the things that we do. They're mini campaigns that we do that I write a lot about. They're mini campaigns that we do to test and assess, are we at 20% participation in the union? Are we at 30% participation in the union? Are we at 60, 70, 80, 90, or 100% participation? And for people like me and the people who went to LA, building 100% participation is our goal. And it's totally possible. They reunited a 34,000 worker union where people had been like put to sleep. Like that's the word people use sometimes. You know, we're going to activate them like every 4 years. Like almost like people like a little bunny in people or something. So they spent 4 years doing 12 structure tests, which were mini campaigns, where they methodically tracked the engagement school by school across 900 schools until they knew they were ready. 12 major structure tests, 12 major mini campaigns, 4 years, radical, brilliant rank and file leadership who hired really smart professional organizers. And that team together literally set Los Angeles on fire. And what they won is a lot of the country that I would like to live in completely. They won, in case you missed it, the first reduction in class sizes that anyone in the United States can remember if they're in the education sector. They won a reduction in class sizes. You know, on a good day, we hold the line on like 45, you know, whatever. It's pathetic out there, right? So what they won was a structural, contractually enforceable, massive reduction in class size. They won an immigrant defense fund that'll be partly paid for by the school district itself to defend against the ICE raids happening in our public school system in the United States right now, to defend immigrants. They won an expansion of community schools and an end to police in 30, to start with 30 schools, to end the policing practices, the racist policing practices in the LA schools. They won a Green New Deal in Los Angeles. They actually won a green spaces agreement as part of the collective bargaining agreement to force the school district to remove crap old buildings and start planting green grass and gardens so that the low-income kids in the city of Los Angeles know what green means. And they won an amazing raise and a whole bunch of stuff I can't even talk about. But like, note, I want to say one closing thing about this. When you build 100% out strikes with massive community support, and when you know you have to intentionally build it to get it. There was a moment in the summer of 2018, so the strike is January 2019, there's a moment in the summer of 2018 when the district leadership says, we're going to take you to court. Now, I also know that Winnipeg's nickname back going into 1919 was Injunction City, right? I read about that. I just like to call Winnipeg winning in Winnipeg now. But anyway, there's a lot of history of injunctions leading up to the 1919 strike. So the boss was threatening injunctions against the teachers in the summer of 2018. And what the boss was saying was that all of those topics I just listed to you, except for reducing class size, every one of those topics, anti-racist program, get the cops out of the schools, immigrant rights defense fund, blah, 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 green spaces, all of those things were called non-mandatory subjects of bargaining under labor law. And so the boss said, we're going to sue you unless you take them off the table. Now they had been doing big parent community open bargaining sessions to get to those topics in earlier 2017. So here comes summer of 2018, and only because they had done, at that point, 10 really serious structure tests and knew that they were at like 93% participation, school by school across 900 schools, did they know that they could do a smart strategic move, which was they agreed to withdraw all of those important topics, the social justice topics, and they went back to people quietly, because you can't say this in a leaflet, you know, a lot of legal issues, and they said, look, if we can get to 100% out strike with the community behind us, we're going to put every one of those issues back on the table, and we're not settling without them. But right now, we have to pull them off the table. This is not going to be in the history books, by the way. So when you think about 1919, there's a lot of complicated shit that was going on that we don't know. That's what I'm trying to say about this. And they literally had to withdraw every one of those bargaining proposals and had enough structure that the parents understood strategically why it was happening when it happened. And the boss was out crowing that the union leaders finally grew up and withdrew all those stupid topics. Like that was the messaging, right? And when they were out on strike and they got into the Victory Lab, and the mayor of the city called them into City Hall in January and said, okay, we got to get this thing over with because we're on day 6 of the hell going on in the city of Los Angeles and every single school closed. And the first thing that Alex Caputo Pearl, the president of the union, said when they walked in was, this strike's not over until you put every one of those issues back on the table. And they did. And they won on every issue. So that's what building to 100% participation means. You can do it. We know how to do it. People in this room know how to do it. We actually have to dig into the discipline and do it. When you set out to build a strike-ready organization capable of getting us to something like a 1919 general strike in 2030, you got to wake up every morning and think about how we're getting 100% participation. It's what I do in every campaign I've ever had the pleasure of running. Every campaign. What am I doing to get to 100% participation today? You can totally do it. And I'm really closing now. I'm so struck every day by what's going on in the world. The front page of the city business section is like littered with the crisis that we all face, right? The headline is crowd rallies to save Concordia ER. And then the story below that is hungry students don't learn, the teachers union says. So this is very interesting and complicated, right? Because we have an amazing thing going on about austerity all over Winnipeg, and 2 sheet stories about people who are fighting back. And I would like to ask about that little Concordia ER fight, and back to 1919 for a second, what would Ethel Johns do? That amazing nurse leader back in 1919 who they wound up getting rid of because she let the strikers bring milk and stuff to the hospital. So I want to close by thinking about Ethel and about the crisis that we're in. And folks, it is time to either fight or be fucked. And I'm sorry, that's it. So let's fight! I should just say this, because of that question. There is afoot what's going to be a 5-part online training course. I've never done this, and I'm about to do it, so keep your eyes out. The Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in Germany, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, is funding me if they're launching, it's going to be crazy, like a 5-part online training course. Because I can't, it turns out, be in every country all the time. I don't know why, but I can't. So I just spent a lot of time working in Germany and going back and back and back and then stopping. And stopping because they realized that really people don't know what charting is all over the place, and they don't know what structure tests are. So in the fall, dates are not hammered out, the agreement was just reached though, there will actually be an online training course. So just keep an eye out for that. But structure tests and leader ID, those are 2 buzzwords. I always say my 4 favorite words on planet Earth are leader identification and structure test. I know, and I'm a radical feminist, but those are the things I love. So, and they really matter. So the little things you saw are wall charts. I'm very old school. I know we have big computer systems that back up our databases, but the point of something called big wall charts that I deeply believe in and talk about everywhere I go, basically, those are the things you're describing, where you put every single worker's name who works in the facility that you're in on big wall charts, and then you begin to do structure tests. So you don't put the names up of the activists coming to the meeting, okay? This is my 2 seconds on it. What you don't do is put the names up of people who like you and come to your meetings. That's not the problem. The problem is everyone who's not coming to your meetings. That's how you build a 100% participation movement. Definitely to get 95 out of 96 unions on strike, right? So you'd be structure testing the labor movement and structure testing within every organization. So big wall charts, this thing I believe very strongly in, despite the fact that computers do all sorts of databasing. The difference between what I call wall charting, where you put every single worker's name up in the facility, and then you begin to do what we call the structure test, the mini campaigns, and then you begin to put dots and marks so that everyone, the workers themselves, can see which of their coworkers are participating in each of the mini campaigns and who's not participating. The point of the method is to teach the rank and file workers how to build their own power. That's the point of wall charting. And everywhere I go, they're like, yeah, we have databases that do that now. And I'm like, I don't really give a shit about your database. I mean, I do, by the way. I'm pro-database. I'm not kidding. Like, it's important we have databases that back up the work. But if I'm trying to teach as many million thousands of workers as I can, what do they need to do to know that they're ready to strike? They need to be engaged in something called public big wall charting. Now, you show the bosses. Everyone but the bosses sees it, right? Every worker in that work area sees them. So if you don't know much more about leader ID and structure tests, they're all over the book, No Shortcuts. And in Los Angeles, part of why it's so amazing, I had to pull it out. I was going to walk through them, but like, oh, hell no. But I do a chart that's in the forthcoming book where I outline every single structure test I did in Los Angeles, what the test was, what it looked like, and how they did on it to show you the growth from like what people would say apathy-wide union to 100% outstrike with the parents standing with them. That's conscious work, and it took 4 years, so you can have a 2030 general strike. Thank you.